When I saw my husband open the laptop and click on the unfamiliar folder, my breath caught, not because I was afraid he'd find something trivial, but because I knew exactly what was in there. That single folder held moments I had convinced myself no one would ever see. Moments that weren't meant for him. My voice got stuck in my throat as I crossed the room, my hands shaking in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. "What's this?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm, as if he wasn't already bracing for the answer. He pressed play on the first video, and I watched his face freeze, the color draining out of it. My chest tightened, and I tried to grab the laptop, my fingers brushing the keyboard, but he moved it out of reach without even looking at me. His eyes didn't leave the screen. He kept watching. The sound of my own voice echoed in the room, mixed with another laugh, not my husband's, not my son's. I felt my heart hammering so loud it almost drowned everything else. There it was, the proof. The thing I told myself I could hide forever. My throat went dry as I whispered, "It's not what you think." But even as the words came out, I knew they didn't matter. Not now. Not after 3 months of choices I couldn't undo. This was the moment I feared would come. And yet, maybe it wasn't the whole truth. Maybe there's still a part you don't know. Before I tell you everything, before I peel back the layers of what really happened, leave me a comment, tell me where you're watching this from, and answer this. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy you thought you could bury it forever, only to watch it claw its way back into the light? The day it started felt painfully ordinary, the kind of day that slips through your fingers without leaving a mark. I woke early, as I always did, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I no longer saw the point of sleeping in. The kettle boiled, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and I stood by the window watching the same neighbor walk his same dog, the same way he had every morning for years. My life had become a quiet loop of habits, each one blurring into the next until the days lost their edges. My husband sat at the kitchen table, already buried in his emails, his phone lighting up every few seconds with another message. He sipped his coffee without tasting it, murmured a half-hearted morning, and went back to typing. I didn't resent him for it, not exactly. He had always been that way, driven, focused, good at building walls between his work and the rest of the world. But lately those walls felt higher. It wasn't anger that settled in me, it was something harder to name, something between loneliness and numbness. It wasn't until the doorbell rang that something shifted. I hadn't even remembered she was coming. The new English tutor for my son. She stood there, holding a stack of books and papers, hair slightly out of place from the wind, smiling in a way that felt unpracticed but warm. She looked like she belonged anywhere and nowhere all at once, and for some reason, that made me nervous. I let her in, her voice filling the hallway as she introduced herself, and I watched her eyes dart around the house, taking in the framed photos, the stack of unopened mail on the counter, the half-wilted plant by the window. I told myself there was nothing unusual about her visit. She was here for lessons, that was all. But even in that first hour, as I made tea in the kitchen, I noticed details I couldn't unnotice. The way her laugh seemed too big for the room, spilling over into corners where it didn't belong. The way she crouched next to my son, pointing at his workbook, her fingers brushing the pages with a kind of focus that made the mundane seem deliberate. I told myself I was just observing, nothing more. When she left that day, the house felt quieter, not the peaceful quiet of a long exhale, but the sharp quiet that follows an unexpected sound. I stood at the window, watching her walk down the street, and I caught myself wondering when she'd be back. The thought annoyed me, it felt intrusive, like an uninvited guest in my head. I shook it off, stacked the cups in the sink, and reminded myself that people come and go all the time. Tutors. Lessons. Nothing more. But that evening, as I wiped the kitchen counters, I noticed the faint smell of her perfume still lingering in the air. It wasn't strong, barely there, but enough to make me pause. I ran my hand along the smooth wood of the table where she'd sat, and for a reason I couldn't name, I felt my chest tighten. Later, when my husband came home, he asked how the lesson went without looking up from his phone. "Fine," I said, and the word felt too small, too flat. He nodded, already scrolling, already moving on. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing as he fell asleep. Everything about the day should have been unremarkable, forgettable. But there was a faint hum in me, like the aftertaste of something I couldn't quite place. I told myself it would pass. It didn't. The next morning, as I stood by the sink, the thought came unbidden, quiet but undeniable. I was looking forward to the next lesson. The second lesson came on a Thursday, and all day I found myself moving slower, as if time itself had thickened. I cleaned the kitchen twice, rearranged a stack of cookbooks that hadn't been touched in years, and even ironed the tea towels, though no one would notice. I told myself I was simply keeping the house tidy, being a good host, but under that excuse something restless stirred. I was waiting, and I didn't want to admit it. When the doorbell rang, it sounded sharper than usual. She stood there again, hair pulled back this time, wearing a simple sweater that somehow made her look even younger. The same stack of books was tucked under her arm, but there was something else, too, a small thermos clutched in her hand. "I brought tea," she said lightly, and her voice filled the hallway in a way that felt almost too big for it. I smiled back, a reflex more than a choice, and stepped aside to let her in. The lesson began much like the first. She sat with my son at the kitchen table, flipping through worksheets, her tone shifting easily between patience and encouragement. I busied myself by slicing fruit, stacking plates, anything to look occupied while I hovered nearby. But I kept catching fragments of their conversation, her laughter when he mispronounced a word, the gentle way she corrected him, and each sound seemed to echo louder in me than it should have. When my son excused himself to take a call from a friend, the house tilted. Suddenly the space felt different, as though the absence of one voice made every other sound sharper. The clock ticked. The kettle hummed. She looked up at me, and for the first time, there was no buffer between us. We ended up sitting across from each other at the table, an untouched cup of tea cooling between us. She asked simple things at first, how long I'd lived in this house, whether I'd ever been abroad. But her eyes didn't leave mine when she asked, "What do you do for yourself?" The question lodged in me like a stone. For myself. I opened my mouth, ready to answer, but nothing came. I could list the errands I ran, the meals I cooked, the laundry folded into perfect stacks, but those weren't answers. Those were obligations. I shrugged, feeling oddly exposed, and said, "I don't really know." The silence after that wasn't awkward, not exactly, it was heavier, like the room had been holding its breath and didn't want to exhale. Her gaze held mine a moment longer than it needed to. I felt my fingers tighten around the mug in front of me, as if grounding myself. And then we kissed. It happened so quickly, so quietly, that even as it happened, I half convinced myself it hadn't. No sudden movement, no dramatic lean across the table. Just an inch closing, a pause breaking, and then a touch that was there and gone. We didn't speak about it. There was no rush of explanation, no awkward apology, no nervous laughter to dilute the air. She turned back to her books. I stood to refill the kettle. Everything moved as it had before, but nothing felt the same. After she left, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The room smelled faintly of the tea she had brought, the taste still on my tongue. The clock ticked, slow and steady, and for once I wasn't aware of time in the usual way. I wasn't counting chores, or minutes until my husband came home. I was just sitting, staring at the cup she'd used, the faint lipstick mark she hadn't wiped away. That night, I barely spoke during dinner. My husband didn't notice. He talked about quarterly reports and an upcoming meeting, his voice a low drone over the clink of cutlery. When he asked if the lesson went well, I nodded, because nodding was easier than speaking. Later, in bed, I lay still as he turned over and drifted into sleep. I stared at the ceiling again, but this time the ceiling felt closer, like the walls themselves had crept inward. My chest felt tight, my thoughts looping over the same single moment. I told myself it was a slip, something meaningless, a thing that could be ignored if I willed it hard enough. But deep down, I knew I would be waiting for her next visit. The weekend passed in a haze, every hour both sluggish and sharp, like I was trapped in a strange in-between. I went through the motions, laundry folded, dishes washed, errands ticked off a list, but everything felt slightly tilted. I couldn't stop replaying that moment, the one I had been trying to convince myself didn't mean anything. The more I tried to push it aside, the more it pressed in, refusing to be ignored. By Monday morning, my husband mentioned he might have to leave for a few days on business. He said it casually, as if it were nothing more than a minor disruption to his schedule. "It's just a short trip," he muttered over his coffee, barely looking up from his phone. I nodded like it was unimportant, but inside, I felt a small shift, the faintest lurch in my chest. When Tuesday came, he confirmed it. He'd leave Wednesday night. That night, while we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television flickering between us, I caught myself imagining the house without him. Not out of resentment, not even from a place of desire, but from a strange curiosity, like peeking into a room you'd forgotten existed. What would it feel like, just me, the boy, and her? The third lesson was set for Thursday. All Wednesday, I moved through the day with a quiet hum under my skin. It wasn't joy, exactly, and it wasn't dread either, it was something messier, harder to name. I found myself cleaning again, though the house didn't need it. I baked a loaf of bread I hadn't planned on making, just for the sake of having something warm on the counter. When my husband left that evening, suitcase in hand, he kissed my cheek like he always did. "Don't wait up for my call," he said, "I might be late." I promised I wouldn't. I stood at the window watching his car pull out of the driveway, and I told myself that nothing would change just because he was gone. But Thursday came. When she rang the bell, the air already felt different. Maybe it was only in my head, but the house felt more open, like it had been holding its breath for her arrival. She stepped inside with the same easy grace, but her smile seemed warmer, or maybe I just noticed it more. The lesson began as usual. They sat at the table, books open, pens scratching. I hovered nearby, not quite part of it but not quite separate either. The small talk was familiar now, the rhythm of her voice something I'd started to expect, maybe even crave. At one point, my son excused himself again, another phone call, another reason to leave the table. This time it didn't feel like coincidence. Suddenly it was just the two of us again, the way it had been before. The same table, the same tea cooling between us, but everything felt heavier, more fragile. She asked about the bread I'd baked. I said it was just something to pass the time. Her eyes lingered on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt it. That same shift. That same quiet pull. We didn't speak about what had happened the last time. But it lived in the space between us, in the slight pause before we made eye contact, in the way our hands both stayed too still, like we were afraid to reach for anything. When she left that day, I walked her to the door. It should have been nothing. Just a goodbye, a polite smile, a casual "see you next week." But when the door closed, I didn't move. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, staring at the empty space where she had been. Later, I sat at the kitchen table again, the smell of bread and tea clinging to the room. My phone buzzed, it was my husband, texting that he'd landed safely. I stared at the message, then set the phone face down without replying. That night, after my son went to bed, the silence in the house felt strange. Not empty, but expectant, like the walls themselves knew something I hadn't said out loud. I thought about the way she looked at me, the way her words seemed to cut through the dullness I had been living in. And for the first time, I realized that I hadn't just been waiting for the next lesson. I had been waiting for her. I woke the next morning with a knot in my stomach, the kind that makes you feel like you've forgotten something important, even if you can't name what it is. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that should have felt calm, but instead it felt thick, almost claustrophobic. My husband texted to say he had a long day ahead and might not call until late. I read the message twice before putting the phone face down on the table, not because I didn't want to hear from him, but because every message reminded me of the distance between who I had been and who I was now becoming. The day passed in fragments, laundry in the washer, a trip to the store for groceries, the constant sound of my son's music coming from his room. But in the back of my mind, a single thought circled like a bird that refused to land. Would she come today? She wasn't scheduled to. Her visits were routine, set days, set times. But something about the way she'd looked at me yesterday lingered, and I kept catching myself listening for the doorbell, as if some part of me expected the pattern to break. By evening, the air felt heavy, almost charged. I sat on the couch pretending to watch television, flipping through channels without seeing anything. At one point, my son came into the room and asked what was for dinner, and I realized I hadn't even thought about it. I ordered takeout, something I rarely did, and he gave me a strange look when I told him we'd just have pizza. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up longer than I needed to. I walked through the house turning off lights one by one, but instead of feeling like I was settling the house for the night, I felt like I was pacing, waiting for something undefined. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I turned over the pillow, stared at the empty space next to me where my husband would normally be, and felt the strangest mixture of guilt and relief. The next morning, the knock on the door startled me. It wasn't the doorbell this time, just a soft knock, almost hesitant. When I opened it, she stood there, not in her usual work clothes, but in jeans and a light jacket, holding a folder loosely in one hand. I was nearby, she said, as if that explained everything. I didn't question it. I didn't ask why she came when there was no lesson scheduled, why she wasn't with someone her own age, living her own life. Instead, I stepped back to let her in, and the moment the door closed, the house felt different again, like something had shifted in the air. We ended up in the living room this time, the books and pens still in her bag, forgotten. She sat on the edge of the couch, looking around like she was seeing the room for the first time. I sat across from her in the armchair, my hands knotted in my lap. We talked about nothing at first, how the weather was turning colder, how the town seemed quieter lately. But there was an undercurrent in every word, a weight to even the smallest exchange. When she asked how long I had lived here, I told her almost 20 years, and when she said it must feel like home, I hesitated before answering. At one point she reached for a magazine on the table, her fingers brushing against my hand as she picked it up. It was the lightest touch, barely there, but it jolted me more than it should have. She noticed. I could see it in the way her eyes flicked to mine and then away again. The conversation slowed, then stopped entirely. We just sat there for a while, the silence not empty but full of unspoken questions, of tension neither of us wanted to name. Eventually she stood, saying she should go. I walked her to the door again, the same door where we'd said goodbye the day before. She paused before stepping out, and for a second I thought she might say something, anything, to fill the space between us. Instead, she just nodded and left. When the door closed, I leaned against it, my forehead resting on the cool wood. The quiet of the house pressed in again, but now it felt even heavier. Later that night, my husband called. He asked how everything was, and I told him it was fine. He didn't hear the pause in my voice. After the call, I sat on the couch staring at the folder she'd left on the coffee table. She'd forgotten it, or maybe she hadn't. I didn't open it. But I couldn't stop looking at it. And for the first time, I wondered not just when she'd come back, but what I would do when she did. The day started gray, the kind of gray that seemed to press against the windows and dull the edges of everything inside. Rain tapped softly at the glass, a slow rhythm that made the house feel heavier, like it was weighed down by its own walls. I moved through the rooms almost aimlessly, straightening pillows that didn't need straightening, folding the same blanket twice. There was an unease in me I couldn't quite name, but I carried it everywhere I went. By late morning, I was standing at the counter, staring at the loaf of bread I'd baked the day before, not hungry but unwilling to throw it away. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen expecting another text from my husband, another line about meetings or delayed flights. But it wasn't him. It was her. "Will you be home this afternoon?" I read the words again, and for a moment I didn't move. My fingers hovered over the keyboard of my phone. The answer should have been easy. But nothing about it felt easy. "Yes," I typed, then erased it. "I should be," I wrote instead, as if softening the certainty could soften everything else. When the doorbell rang hours later, I already knew it would be her. She stood in the doorway with rain clinging to her jacket, droplets in her hair. She looked both out of place and entirely at home, like the storm had delivered her to my doorstep. I stepped aside to let her in, and the smell of rain came with her, fresh and sharp. She slipped off her jacket, hanging it carefully over the chair. "Sorry," she said, her voice quiet, "I didn't mean to intrude." But she wasn't intruding, and we both knew it. The house was too quiet, my son out with friends, my husband still away. The ticking of the clock in the kitchen felt louder than usual, like it was counting down to something I couldn't stop. We ended up in the kitchen, the rain outside a constant backdrop. I made tea because it gave me something to do with my hands, but the ritual felt clumsy, the clink of the spoon in the cup too sharp. She leaned against the counter, close enough that I could see the rain still drying in strands of her hair. Her eyes met mine, and there was no buffer this time, no stack of worksheets, no half-heard conversation between her and my son. Just us, in a room that suddenly felt smaller than it had ever been. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, the rain, the bread on the counter, the kind of surface words that were safe. But underneath them was something heavier, like stones under water, distorting every ripple. At one point, she reached for a towel to wipe her hands, her fingers brushing mine for just a second. The touch was nothing, almost, but it stayed. We stood there in the kitchen, the silence stretching, until something broke in the space between us. We didn't plan it, we didn't even move suddenly. We just closed the small distance that had been hovering between us since that first lesson. We kissed. It wasn't loud or dramatic or wild. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but there was something irreversible about it all the same. When we stepped back, the room felt both exactly the same and completely different. The kettle still sat on the stove. The rain still tapped at the window. But there was a weight in my chest I couldn't push away. She didn't stay long after that. She slipped on her still damp jacket, nodded once, and left, the door closing softly behind her. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty space she'd left. The tea had gone cold on the counter, untouched. That evening, when my husband called, I answered, my voice steady, my words routine. "Yes, we're fine. No, nothing new." After the call, I sat in the dark living room, listening to the rain that hadn't stopped. I told myself again, like I had before, that maybe it didn't mean anything. But this time, I didn't believe it. The rain finally stopped the next morning, leaving the world outside washed clean, but inside the house everything felt heavy, as if the air itself had absorbed what had happened the day before. I woke early again, earlier than I needed to, pacing between the kitchen and the living room like a restless shadow. I could still feel the trace of that kiss, not on my lips, not even in my body, but in my thoughts, like a faint hum that wouldn't quiet down no matter how many times I tried to silence it. My husband called before breakfast. His voice was tired, distracted, the way it always was when he was away. He asked how things were, and I answered automatically, my words light and practiced, the safe kind of sentences that left no room for questions. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time, as if it might suddenly demand a confession from me. The day moved slowly, each hour dragging more than the last. I cleaned again, though there was nothing left to clean. I reorganized the pantry, dusted picture frames, folded the same dish towel 3 times. Every task was an attempt to quiet my mind, but none of it worked. By noon, I gave up pretending to be busy. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee I hadn't finished, when my phone buzzed again. Her message was simple, *, do you want to meet later? *. I didn't type my answer right away. My fingers hovered over the screen, the question hanging in the air around me, even though it was just a handful of words. I could have ignored it. I could have said no. But the truth is, I didn't want to. Where? I wrote back. That's how we ended up in the small cafe near the park, the kind of place where no one really notices you. It wasn't a secretive meeting, not really, but it felt like one. I got there first, sitting by the window with my coat still on, the mug of tea in front of me growing cold before I'd even touched it. When she walked in, the light behind her made her look almost blurred, like I couldn't quite focus. She smiled, and I felt that same shift, the same quiet pull that had been there since the very first day. We talked about safe things at first, her classes, my errands, the kind of small talk that filled the space without giving anything away. But under the surface, every word felt loaded, like there was something else behind it we weren't saying. At one point, she leaned across the table to show me something on her phone, a photo of a book she thought my son might like. Her hand brushed mine as she handed it over. A simple touch, brief, but enough to send a spark of awareness through me, the same way it had the first time. We didn't stay long. Neither of us wanted to draw attention, and neither of us said it out loud, but there was an unspoken understanding, we were testing the edges of something fragile. On the way home, I walked slower than usual, the cold air biting at my cheeks, but my mind felt even noisier than the street around me. I didn't know what to call what we were doing. I didn't even know if it needed a name. All I knew was that it felt impossible to stop. When I got back, the house felt smaller. The walls seemed closer, the silence heavier. I caught myself listening for sounds, the creak of the door, the hum of the kettle, as if they could ground me, but they didn't. That evening, my son stayed in his room, his laughter muffled through the walls as he talked to friends. I sat in the living room, staring at the untouched pile of magazines on the coffee table, the tea from the cafe still on my tongue. The phone rang again. My husband's voice filled the room, warm but distant, his words about flight changes and work dinners a reminder of the life that had been mine for years. I answered every question, smiled at the right moments, but my mind kept drifting. After we hung up, I stayed where I was, the dark settling into the corners of the room. I thought about the cafe, the park, the brush of her hand across mine. I thought about how easy it had been to say yes when she asked to meet. And for the first time, I admitted to myself that I wasn't just waiting for her anymore. I was seeking her out. The night came quiet, almost ordinary, with my husband still away and my son asleep in his room. The house held its breath, as if it too was waiting for something to shift. I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, the quiet ticking of the clock marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. She arrived later than usual that evening, the rain from the earlier day having given way to a crisp chill that seeped in through the cracks of the window frames. She came not for a lesson, not for the books or the language, but for the space between us that had grown too crowded to ignore. We stayed close, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread. It was not passion that bound us, but a quiet understanding, the kind that settles without words, in the space where glances linger too long and breaths hitch just before they exhale. We kissed. We kissed, and it was neither hurried nor hesitant, but a moment carved out of the relentless tide of the days before it. We kissed, and in that small act, everything changed, the unspoken fears, the silent wishes, the questions we'd both been too afraid to voice. When morning came, the world outside was still dark, but inside the house everything had shifted. The air felt thicker, the walls closer, and the quiet was heavier. I watched her leave with the first light, the door closing softly behind her, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and something more elusive, a trace of something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. I spent the day in a haze, caught between the weight of what had happened and the life I was still meant to live. My husband's calls were distant, his questions routine, but I heard none of it. I was caught in the aftermath, in the quiet aftermath where nothing was the same and everything was still uncertain. The house, once a place of comfort, felt like a threshold, a place where the past met the present and the future hung in fragile balance. I didn't know what would come next, only that there was no going back to the way things had been. And that terrified me more than anything. The morning after she left, I walked through the house in silence, my bare feet brushing against the cold floorboards, every sound amplified in the stillness. The kettle's whistle seemed too loud, the clink of the spoon against the mug almost jarring. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was pressing in, like a heavy curtain around me. When my husband's car finally pulled into the driveway that evening, it felt as though two worlds were colliding. He stepped inside with the familiar smell of travel on his coat, his smile weary but warm. He set his bag by the door and kissed my cheek, his lips cold from the outside air, and for the briefest second, I wondered if he could feel it, that difference, that invisible line I had crossed. He didn't seem to. He asked about the week, about our son, about the house. His voice was casual, almost distracted, as he pulled out small souvenirs from his trip, chocolates in a crinkled bag, a scarf from an airport shop. It should have been comforting, this return to routine, but instead it felt like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit anymore. Dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that would have gone unnoticed before, but now it screamed. Every scrape of the fork, every pause in conversation, was heavy with what wasn't being said. He talked about meetings in hotel rooms, about long lines at airports, and I nodded, my hands steady even though inside, nothing felt steady. Later, when the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, he sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed at something on the screen. I sat opposite him, pretending to read, though my eyes barely moved across the page. I felt his gaze on me once or twice, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, but he didn't ask. And I didn't offer. That night, lying beside him, the familiar weight of his presence felt strangely foreign. The rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of him, it should have been grounding, but instead it was a reminder of the gap that had formed, one I couldn't bring myself to bridge. The next morning, my phone buzzed. Her name on the screen made my stomach tighten. The message was short, asterisk, "Are you okay?" Asterisk, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that couldn't be unsaid. I stared at it for a long time before replying with something simple but safe, that said nothing and everything at once, asterisk yes. Asterisk. But even as I typed it, I wasn't sure if it was true. The days blurred after that. The house felt like it was holding a secret, one that clung to the walls, to the spaces between footsteps. Every time the phone buzzed, I flinched, half expecting it to be her, half afraid it wouldn't be. My husband moved through those days unaware, or at least, I told myself he was unaware. He asked the usual questions, made the usual comments, his voice even and calm, but sometimes, when his eyes lingered on me for just a second too long, I wondered if he was starting to sense it, the shift in the air. And yet, the silence between us wasn't just about guilt. It was also about fear, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of shattering whatever fragile balance was still holding the house together. In the evenings, after he went to bed, I would sit in the dark living room, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, listening to the creak of the house. It was in those hours that I felt the weight of it most, the choices, the lines crossed, the impossibility of undoing any of it. One night, as I turned off the last light and stood at the bottom of the stairs, I looked back at the closed door, the quiet rooms, and I knew something with an aching certainty. The truth would not stay buried forever. And when it came to the surface, it would not do so gently. The morning began with the sound of my husband's voice in the kitchen, low and steady as he spoke into his phone. The cadence was familiar, half a conversation about schedules, clients, and obligations, but I couldn't make out the words. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, hand resting on the railing, listening without meaning to, feeling the quiet pull of a world that seemed both distant and uncomfortably close. I went through the motions of my day, breakfast, dishes, a quick sweep of the hallway, but there was a tension in the air that even the smallest tasks couldn't smooth away. It clung to me like static, an unease I couldn't shake. By afternoon, my husband had retreated to his office upstairs, his door closed, his voice an occasional murmur through the walls. I was in the living room when I noticed his laptop open on the coffee table. The screen was dark, but the lid slightly ajar, as if he'd stepped away mid-thought. I didn't intend to touch it. I didn't even move closer at first. But there was a shift in the house that I felt, though I couldn't explain why, a heaviness, an expectation, like the quiet before a storm. When I passed by again, the screen was lit. A window was open, a folder I didn't recognize sitting at the center of the screen. I froze. It wasn't one of mine. I knew every folder on this laptop, every place where bills and recipes and travel itineraries lived. This one wasn't familiar. My stomach tightened as I watched his mouse cursor move on its own, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs telling me he was still on the phone. I didn't open anything. I didn't need to. One of the files was already playing. A video. Not long. Just a fragment. The sound of my own voice filled the room first. Light, casual, but unmistakable. And then, hers. It wasn't what I feared. It wasn't some explicit betrayal flashing across the screen, but it was enough. The two of us sitting too close at the table, laughing about something no one else would find funny. The kind of laugh you don't share with just anyone. The camera angle suggested it was an old lesson, maybe my son had been recording for schoolwork, or maybe the software had auto-saved a session. I didn't know. But my husband would. The weight of that truth pressed down on me harder than I'd expected. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the screen as though it might change if I stared long enough. Upstairs, the floor creaked. His voice went quiet. I reached for the laptop, instinct more than thought, my fingers brushing the keyboard just as I heard his footsteps on the stairs. The sound was light, unhurried, but it might as well have been thunder. I closed the lid quickly, not slamming it, just enough to stop the sound. I stood in the middle of the living room, heart hammering, when he stepped into view. He glanced at me, then at the laptop, his eyes narrowing slightly, not suspicion, not yet, just the kind of sharpness that comes when someone senses a disturbance in the familiar. He didn't ask about it. Not directly. Instead, he said something simple, "Have you eaten?" I nodded, even though I hadn't. The rest of the day moved slowly, each hour stretching like pulled thread. He didn't bring up the laptop again, but I caught him looking at me more than once, quick glances, the kind that seemed casual but weren't. By evening, I couldn't tell if the tension was in him or in me, or if it was just in the air between us. After dinner, he went upstairs, his steps measured, his face unreadable. I sat alone at the table, staring at the laptop still closed on the coffee table. My phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen. "Everything okay?" the message read. I didn't answer right away. I stared at those two words until they blurred, my mind replaying the sound of our laughter from that video, the way it might sound to someone who didn't understand. And for the first time, I wondered if my husband already knew, or if he was just waiting for me to say it. Either way, the silence between us was growing too loud to ignore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark beside my husband, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, watching the faint glow of the streetlight cut across the ceiling in narrow strips. My eyes followed those lines like they might give me answers, but there were none. My body was still, but my mind moved restlessly, circling the same questions again and again. How much did he know, and how much longer could I keep pretending nothing had happened? Morning came gray and cool, the kind of morning where even the walls seemed tired. I moved quietly through the house, careful with every sound. The kettle hissed. The spoon clicked against the mug. My hands worked automatically, but my thoughts weren't in the kitchen, they were tangled in a mess of guilt and relief and dread. He came down the stairs slower than usual, a mug already in his hand, his face unreadable in the dim light. There was no accusation there, but no warmth either. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that weighed more than shouting ever could. We sat at the table, the silence between us stretching until it felt brittle. He broke it first, his voice calm, almost too calm, as he talked about his plans for the day, meetings, errands, small things. I nodded, murmured answers, but it all felt distant, as if we were both acting out a script we hadn't written. Later, when the house was empty except for the two of us, I found myself standing at the counter with my hands resting on the edge, my nails pressing into the wood. The words came before I even decided to say them. "I need to tell you something." The sentence hung in the air, heavier than I'd expected. He looked at me, his eyes steady, but his hands tightened slightly around his coffee mug. I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't. But I told him enough. Enough for the air in the room to change. Enough for him to sit back in his chair and not speak for a long time. Enough for me to feel my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited for whatever came next. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. Just silence, long, deep, and sharp enough to cut. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, the kind of quiet that made me feel smaller, not because he was trying to hurt me, but because there was nothing left to hide behind. After that, the day blurred. She didn't come to the house again. No messages, no calls. The absence of her presence was louder than her voice had ever been. The house felt different, emptier somehow, though everyone was still here. My husband moved through the rooms quietly, like someone navigating unfamiliar ground. In the evenings, we sat in the same spaces we always had, but the space between us was different. Not broken exactly, but not whole either. Something had shifted, something that couldn't shift back. One night, days later, I stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the garden as the last light faded. The glass was cold under my palm. I thought about everything that had happened, the lessons, the tea, the laughter that had been too easy, the kiss that changed everything, the morning after that felt like it would never end. I thought about what I'd lost and what I'd done and what I might still lose. The house was quiet behind me, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was a quiet full of things unspoken, of decisions made, of truths that couldn't be taken back. And I knew, standing there in that dim light, that life would go on, but never the way it had before.